Network. All right. Well, we have come to our keynote speaker now. I'd like to welcome Anthony Floccavento. Anthony is an organic farmer and sustainable development consultant who lives near Abington, Virginia, in the heart of Appalachia. In 1995, he founded the Appalachian Sustainable Development, which launched a number of enterprises in organic farming and local food, sustainable forestry, and other areas. In 2009, he founded Scale, Inc., a private consulting business which works with communities around the nation and world to catalyze and support ecologically healthy regional economies and food systems. A regular speaker and writer on issues of sustainability, rural development, economies, and food and farming. He has over 100 published articles in publications including The Nation, Yes Magazine, Huffington Post, Now and Then, and other outlets. His book, Building a Healthy Economy from the Bottom Up, Harnessing Real-World Experience for Transformative Change, was published by University Press of Kentucky in June of 2016. I do believe there are some copies available here today. Please welcome Anthony Floccavento.
Hey, glad to be here with you all, and thanks for sticking it out. Of course, there's really, really good speakers. It wasn't hard to. Some conferences, if you're the last speaker, you know there's not going to be many people left, but not here because of your commitment and interest, as well as some really great, solid speakers with a lot of good content. I had to sell at the farmer's market this morning, so I didn't get here till a little after lunch, but I'm delighted to be with you all. And yeah, there are books in the back for sale. Purchase is actually mandatory. They may not have told you that, but you must buy a book. So I want to start with this, and hopefully those of you in the back, by the way, there's still at least 4 or 5 seats up here for if people want to come up. But I want you to look at these images and tell me what one thing all of them share. You've got an emergency room, somebody smoking a cigarette, the little emblem in the middle is a local pasta manufacturer in southeast Ohio. Then there's a young fellow selling organic produce, actually at the Abington Market. You see a Hummer. You see an aerial view of a mountaintop removal strip job, and then a young woman making an artisan bowl. What do all of those have in common?
They all take energy to run.
Say again?
They all take energy to run?
They all take energy to run. That's probably true, yeah, for sure.
That's not the answer you're looking for.
Yeah. Did you say something? Okay.
Humans. They're all human related.
They are, absolutely. Yes, absolutely. Spot on. Anybody else? Yeah.
They're all a choice.
They're all a choice. Yeah, maybe not a choice we make deliberately, consciously, or directly all the time in some cases, but for sure.
They're all on the same planet.
They're all on the same planet. For now, at least. Well, all of these are correct, and then the other point that I wanted to make is that every one of these things contributes to something called the gross domestic product, the GDP. They're all part of economic growth. And as we talk about it, and this is kind of the founding premise of my book and a lot of what I talk about now, is that one of our big problems when we're confronting environmental issues, and for that matter, issues of human health and issues of sort of social dysfunction, is that many of the things that contribute to economic growth are in fact not that good for us, right? And so this is a problem because as far as the GDP is concerned, and keep in mind we've had the GDP, the gross domestic product, for 80 years now, it is still by far the most important measurement as far as elected officials, economists, and all that consider. It's really the main economic measurement that we use and everybody around the world uses. But $1,000 worth of organic produce is no better, and for that matter, no worse than $1,000 worth of gasoline going into a Hummer as far as the GDP is concerned. Except it's actually worse than that. Because as far as our current way of measuring economic well-being, the GDP goes, $1,000 of cigarettes is actually a whole lot better for the economy, because every time you buy a pack of cigarettes, you contribute a tiny little bit to the GDP, which is what Democrats and Republicans alike say we must do. But if you buy 2 packs a day, and you do that for 25 or 30 years, there's a very good chance you'll end up in that emergency room, and then maybe in long-term chronic care, probably on very expensive medication and in some very expensive facilities. So you're a small-time contributor when you're buying cigarettes. When you get emphysema or heart disease or lung cancer, you become a big-time contributor to the gross domestic product. So fundamentally, the way we measure building an economy is upside down and backwards because of the inability to discern between things that are good for us and things that are bad for us. 35 years ago, Wendell Berry, in one of his essays, said that a divorced household is much better for the economy than an intact household, for many of the same reasons. So I often start with this quick analysis of what's wrong with what we've got, which is also how the book begins. So we're going to talk about just real quickly. And to do this, I'm going to use 2 graphs that I'll explain here in a moment. So the first graph is of our food dollars. And this was done by a USDA economist a number of years ago. And he looked at most of the 20th century, from 1910 to about the end of the century. And he said, when you spend $1 on food in the US, where does it go? And he divided it into 3 broad categories. At the bottom, the yellowish part is the inputs that a farmer buys to bring us food. So in my case, that might be compost from Bluntville or Bristol, fencing, diesel fuel, seeds, etc., input costs. The middle one, the red, is what the farmer gets. And then the blue, the part that gets bigger and bigger and bigger, is everything after the calf leaves the farm or the tomato is picked and put on a truck. It's the processing, the aggregation, the washing, the distribution, the packaging, the marketing, the retailing. And so what you see here is that while input costs have increased fairly steadily, the spectacular increase has been in the post-farm. That's by far the biggest part of our food dollar. And farmers are getting the same thing at the end of the 20th century that they were getting at the beginning of the 20th century, which is part of why so many people left farming. And believe me, as a farmer, I can relate to that. So, but fundamentally what this shows is an estrangement. Most of us, and this is changing with the local food movement, wonderfully. Lexi Close, a shout out for her here in Johnson City, has been, one of the many leaders, many of them were younger people, in trying to reconnect us to our food. But still, for the most part, we're estranged from where our food comes from, the farmers. So we don't often recognize the problem with low pricing, because for us, the experience is just what we have in the grocery store. 45 years ago, when gasoline cost 36 cents a gallon and all the other input costs were cheap and we were paying $1.40, a farmer was getting $11 for 100 pounds of milk in the milk pool. Fast forward to 2015, when gas is well over $2, diesel fuel $2.50, milk's $3 or $4 a gallon. Farmers are getting $13.50. So over 45 years, while every element of a farmer's production cost has gone up dramatically, often 4 to 5-fold, they're still getting just a hair more than they were getting in 1970. And when you do that, when you force that onto not only farmers but other people in the economy, you get externalization of costs, right? So many externalities. One of them is the tremendous amount of still soil erosion we have. And when we have that soil erosion, mostly some of it's directly into our rivers, the Clinch, the Powell, the rivers directly coming off of farms here, but a lot of it is coming out of the Midwest, because that's where the corn and soybeans are grown for the livestock industry. And when we get that, you get a dead zone. So we're paying not much for milk. Farmers are externalizing a chunk of their cost. They're planting fence row to fence row, and the net result is a dead zone the size of Rhode Island that materializes pretty much every year in the Gulf of Mexico, with serious consequences, not just for the environment, we might add, but for people trying to make a living off of the Gulf of Mexico, fishermen and whatnot. You also get the externalization of costs in terms of animal welfare, and in the case of confined animal feeding operations, the CAFOs, with tens of thousands of chickens who cannot move, and for that matter, pigs who are extremely intelligent in those sort of conditions. You also get the externalization of that manure, instead of being a resource that's rebuilding our soil, becoming a problem that you have to deal with so it doesn't all go into the creek. You get this kind of externalization. Lucas Benitez, I had the privilege of meeting about 10 years ago, led the coalition of Immokalee farm workers. Because when I met Lucas, he was just beginning this campaign that's had a number of big successes, because he and his cohort in the Florida tomato fields were getting paid 1 penny per pound of tomatoes that they pick. 1 penny per pound. Now keep in mind, you know, we're paying $99 to $2 a pound in the grocery store. It's even more the cost per pound when you talk about the franchise business. A penny a pound translates to $20 per ton of tomatoes that you pick. Or if you can pick 2.5 tons in a day in the hot Florida heat, it's $50. That's an externalization of cost, the wear and tear, the inhumanity on those workers. And then, of course, this cheap food has been part of a number of things that have led us to essentially supersize our lives. I love this image. I don't know how big that burger is, but man, that is one hell of a burger. But I can tell you that when I was a kid, growing up, I remember when McDonald's introduced the Quarter Pounder. I don't know, it was in the early 70s, I think. But at the time, it seemed huge. And now, Hardee's and others market a Quarter Pound burger as a mini burger. So we've supersized our lives, and for a lot of reasons, we're too sedentary and other things, but as a net result of that, the red line, our cost that we pay, the percentage of our household budget on food keeps going down from about 17% in 1960 to under 10% now, but look what's happened to what we spend on so-called health care, a lot of which is treating our illnesses. So that's a quick snapshot of kind of what's wrong from an agricultural perspective. Now I'm going to frame it in terms of what's wrong more broadly in the economy. And this is the second graph. There's 3 lines on it. The line that's going up, the purple line, is worker productivity. It's a simple measurement that economists use to say, if I'm working in a factory or in any other setting, how much of this product do I produce per given unit of time, a day, an hour, whatever, right? The other 2 lines, the 2 green lines, are 2 different ways of measuring wages, hourly wage and household income. So what you see here is that there's those lines were pretty tightly linked until the mid-70s. And ever since then, while worker productivity has continued to grow, wages have been essentially flat. This is a historic relationship that for generations, when workers produced more, they made more. Whether they produced more because they got trained, they got more knowledge, they got more skill and understanding, or because technology equipped them to produce more, they got at least some of the benefit of that. But that relationship has essentially ended. And so all this white space between the worker productivity and those green lines, that's trillions of dollars of stuff being produced and sold. Somebody's making dough, but it ain't the workers. And so what we end up with, where does that productivity go? Where did that income that could have been wages go? Well, it went to the top. We know that. Top 93%. And while those trends tend to be worse in a conservative administration, that trend held through Obama's 8 years, just to sober you up a little bit about that. Another example, one study looked at bonuses given to Wall Street workers, Wall Street executives, and traders in 2014, and they found that the annual bonus, essentially the Christmas bonus to Wall Street, was double what all the full-time minimum wage workers earned over the course of the year. And then, of course, this Oxfam study, perhaps the most startling demonstration at all of our concentration, that the 8 richest people in the world have the equivalent wealth of half of humanity. Right? So that's a moral crisis as well as an economic crisis. So first and foremost, trickle down, don't. And so, unfortunately, again, the debate, Trump exemplifies it, but the truth is that the debate, when a Democrat has been in the White House as well, is still basically around this idea that we need to somehow free up this tiny class of job creators, and through their smarts and their investment, prosperity will trickle down to us. It hasn't worked for 40 years, since Ronald Reagan's first set of tax cuts in the 1940s. When you do that, you tend to concentrate wealth. The amount of our economy that's now financialized in basically Wall Street and financial instruments is dramatically larger than it was a generation ago. But you create what David Korten calls phantom wealth, wealth that is divorced from any real asset. And when you do that, when you put all your eggs in one basket, then real wealth suffers. So in our case, although our practices have improved, but our woods in East Tennessee and Southwest Virginia, our forests, have the most valuable and most diverse hardwoods in the world. They can be managed very sustainably, but they typically don't because we devalue the real wealth. So we cut too much, and then most of the value leaves the area. So we get maximum ecological impact and minimum economic benefit from this phantom wealth mentality. Same thing has happened to our infrastructure, where the American Society of Civil Engineers say we need about $3.6 trillion to bring our bridges and roads and tunnels up to a B-. That's what we need to invest, let alone a state-of-the-art infrastructure. We also know that not only is the economic concentration bad from a moral point of view, but several studies, and I have a number of these in the book, show that actually when we rely on a few big businesses in a community, in a region, the net result is not only worse economically, less stability, more likelihood that jobs will come and go, slower rates of income growth. All of that is true compared to a more diversified local economy, but so too the social and health outcomes are invariably much better when we have a broadly based, diverse, locally rooted economy. Everything from infant mortality up to incarceration. It's really quite extraordinary. So we know really beyond a shadow of a doubt that economic diversity, this what I call bottom-up economy, improves our health and social outcomes as well. Now real quickly, one other thing to flag is the question of regulations. We all know what's going on with Scott Pruitt and the EPA and everything else. And in our part of the world, let's be honest, Southwest Virginia and East Tennessee, there's a fair number of folks that buy into the argument that regulations are bad, right? That you're encumbering the private sector. But here's what happened in the coal industry. The little bar on the right, on the far left there, is the productivity of coal workers in 1950 compared with the productivity of coal workers today. And so the single biggest reason why we've lost so many jobs is indeed because of increases in technology, mechanization. So that you had, before Obama, a dramatic loss of mining jobs while there was still plenty of coal coming out of the mountains. Now there's not very much coal coming out of our part of the world. So that's all a quick snapshot of the bad stuff. And there's more of that if you want. But let's get to the good stuff. So my fundamental premise is that we can build a different economy. And it's based not on wishful thinking, it's based on the fact that I've been lucky to be engaged with people all over the country for many years who are building these bottom-up economies. And in my book, I don't have time to go through all of it in detail, but in the book I talk about 6 transitions that I think all collectively would add up to creating this much more healthy and sustainable local economy. And let's be clear, unless we can build a truly sustainable economy, our environmental and social problems are forever going to be problematic because we need an economy that, as Marjorie Kelly, a brilliant woman, put it, that in its normal functioning creates fair and just outcomes and creates the possibility of humans living on the earth indefinitely. In its normal functioning. Right now we have an economy that it's in normal functioning, extracts wealth, hurts people, creates economic concentration, and is problematic for the environment in all kinds of ways. We can turn that around. So the first transition I talk about is around making our households and our communities much more self-reliant and resilient. And there's a lot of examples. Here's a few of them. Community gardens. You've got them here in Johnson City. We've got them in Southwest Virginia. They're all over the place. ASD, the organization I started, they're one of the Grow Appalachia participants, not only helping people do gardening, but also teaching them how to cook or training them in nutrition and food preservation. Community gardens are not just for the countryside in Detroit, where they have a tremendous amount of vacant land because of their economic catastrophe. There's over 1,800 community gardens in the city of Detroit. Most of them run by nonprofit organizations. Here, this community garden, they built their own greenhouse and high tunnel to raise plants so that they would be, again, more self-reliant. A guy like Will Allen. Will is an amazing fella in Milwaukee who started something called Growing Power. And Will was one of the pioneers of aquaponics, where you link fish production to the production of vegetables and herbs in a sort of zero-waste nutrient cycling system. And Will has taught this all over the world, but especially in Milwaukee, Chicago, and some other places. Again, increasing the resilience and the self-reliance of the local community. Beyond the food system, an idea I love that I'm sure Johnson City could support, I think Abingdon could, but I know Johnson City could, is a tool library. How many folks have heard of tool libraries? Good. So a tool library is a library for tools. And in most cases, there's a little more than 50 of them in the country now. Many of them are connected to the public library, not all of them. But you check out a lawnmower, a rototiller, a weed eater, a circular saw, whatever you need, in the same way you would a book or video. You get a little tutorial, a little bit about safe use and proper utilization. Again, think of how that empowers and builds the resilience of a community. There's a lot of folks who can't afford the tools they need to keep up their car, keep up with their plumbing and their electric and all of this. This creates that possibility. Another one, this is a great one. It was really great to hear all of the talk of what we can do in terms of energy efficiency. So in eastern Kentucky, right across the border from Southwest Virginia, a group called MASON, the Mountain Association for Community Economic Development, they started this program called House Smart Kentucky. They had this dilemma that a lot of working families and poor families were living in trailers or old drafty homes. They were paying tremendously to try to keep their homes warm, sometimes $300 a month or more, still not really warm, but they couldn't afford the energy retrofits that would make their house warm and dry, and there was only so much grant money to go around. So they worked with their local utility, the Rural Electric Co-op, to create a program where now, let's say somebody gets their house looked at by an energy inspector, find out they need $8,000 for double-pane windows, for insulation, maybe for an adjusted HVAC system. They pay that back over time on the savings on their bill. So if they were paying $300 a month, and after the energy retrofits, their bill goes down to $100 a month, the majority of that goes to retire their debt. They get to keep a little of the savings. So the families end up with a warmer home, a more valuable home, slightly lower bill, and they don't go into debt for it, except to pay for it. Really a brilliant idea. So there's a lot of different things in the book. I talk about these examples and then talk about, well, what kind of public policy would support this different sort of economy. So there's a number of things like renewable energy portfolios. There's some local policies that can support this movement towards a more self-reliant and resilient households. Land use policies are very important as well, so that there can be community gardens and urban farms. Second transition is this idea of moving away from the notion of the myth of trickle-down towards these local living economies. Bali calls them living economies. So farmers markets are one of the good representations of this. This is a little image of the Abingdon market where I was this morning. But you know, Abingdon's kind of an unusual town, but it's 8,000 people, and we have 50 vendors and close to 2,000 customers on a Saturday morning during peak season. Now that's a lot of commerce going on, but it's also re-energizing the community. In Buffalo, an organization called PUSH, one of the poorest neighborhoods in Buffalo, high rates of incarceration among people there, high unemployment, and a tremendous loss of their housing stock and their land. PUSH came in, started an initiative where now they're training people in construction, they're training them in installing solar, geothermal, in creating green habitat in the neighborhood to filter stormwater. And these guys and gals, mostly guys, many of them formerly incarcerated, are now making living wages, $15 to $20 an hour, and they're revitalizing their neighborhood at the same time. It's really quite extraordinary. I say now sometimes that we've got to stop asking the question, where are the jobs going to come from, and start asking the question, what is the work that needs to be done? And in Buffalo, they needed to reclaim their declining housing stock, to turn vacant lots into either homes or businesses or gardens or farms, and they're doing it, and they're putting people to work in the process. This guy, Bren Smith, brilliant guys off the east coast of the U.S. I met him about 5 years ago in Harlan, Kentucky, of all places. Bren started fishing commercially when he was 15 years old, dropped out of high school. For the next 3 decades, he fished the east coast and the west coast of the U.S., He saw firsthand the steady decline in fisheries. It hurt him economically, and he knew it was hurting the environment. He created a system he calls vertical ocean farming. Now, this is not like your Thai shrimp farming. Vertical ocean farming, where he uses 2 species of seaweed in combination in vertical columns with 4 very valuable shellfish: mussels, clams, oysters, and scallops. He's figured this out on his own, and in this system, which is 20-acre paddocks, he's teaching other fishermen this as well, 20-acre paddocks along the shoreline. The seaweed and all those filter feeders are cleaning up the surface of the water. They're harvesting very valuable, economically valuable, and very clean shellfish. And once a year, he harvests the seaweed, turns it into a high-protein supplement for either people or animals. The seaweed sequesters extraordinary amounts of carbon. So he's helping the carbon balance, he's cleaning up the local marine ecosystem, and he's producing 6 marketable products. Quite extraordinary. It's a living economy. In Bellingham, Washington, on the other side of the country, they have Habitat, as we do. They have their own solar manufacturer, a great firm called iTech Energy. But Habitat and the solar panel producer went in together so that in a Habitat development of 30 homes, they went ahead and not only built nice, affordable, warm homes, but they put solar panels on every one of them, again, adding to the productivity and resilience of that community. When we have these diverse local economies, these living economies, again, it brings people in, it brings tourists and all that, and that's great, but fundamentally it creates more jobs. The Institute for Local Self-Reliance studied it, and they found that for every $1 million in sales, or $10 million in sales, whereas a set of independent retailers would put 50 people to work, Amazon puts 14 people to work. 50 versus 14. So when you shop Amazon, there's convenience for you, but you are helping to hurt local business and put people out of work. I'm afraid so. And big box retailers like Cabela's and Lowe's and Walmart, about 21. So there's, again, a lot of policy parts of what we could do to build these living economies, but let me give you one stark example. 3 years ago, the city of Bristol, which has been working for quite some time to rebuild its downtown, State Street, in September of 2013, they announced a deal to bring a Cabela's, and it's now at Exit 5 on Interstate 81, the so-called Falls Plaza. And that Cabela's was brought to Exit 5 of the interstate with a $54 million incentive package, mostly deferred taxes, forgiven taxes, some low-interest loans. $54 million. The same day that they announced that, and the Bristol paper made a big deal out of it, a lot of fanfare on the front page, on the back of that same issue of the Bristol paper, there was a little story about the person who had won the Downtown Entrepreneur of the Year award, a very competitive thing for entrepreneurs setting up in the Main Street corridor in Bristol. They described her business, and they talked about the award that she got, $5,000. So the difference between $54 million and $5,000 is approximately $10,000 for every $1 spent on local businesses. So if we're going to talk about building a healthy local economy with lots of independent businesses, our public policy cannot continue to throw hundreds of billions of dollars every year at big boxes and other such. Third transition is this idea of building broadly based prosperity. I'm going to talk a little bit about this and then move very quickly through the others so we can have some conversation. By the way, a great book, and my book has leads to lots of other really, really good books. There's a lot of great stuff written about it, but one is called Slow Money by a guy named Woody Tash. Very interesting book. But Woody in that says we need to start thinking about money as the irrigation of the field of our intentions. So that's a different way of thinking about money. So what would it look like if we not only created jobs and income, but how do we build wealth and durable prosperity? Well, a lot of us have probably said this, we've certainly heard this, that if you give a man a fish, you feed him for a day, but if you teach him how to fish, you feed him for a lifetime. Unless he doesn't have a boat, or a net, or access to water. So my point here is that although retraining, skill building, education, all obviously very important, no question about it, we tend to focus almost exclusively on that. And the fact of the matter is that many people, certainly poor people, but also working folks, simply don't have access to the same sort of capital that others do. So what does capital mean? We think of capital being money. Money's really not capital. Money is a vehicle to secure capital. So here's a few quick examples. When we started Appalachian Harvest back in 1999, it was the first effort in the region to try to help tobacco farmers shift to something else, organic produce in this case, and free-range eggs. But they needed a place to bring that product so it could be basically readied for market. And we took an old tobacco barn, and we borrowed it for the first couple of years from the tobacco farmer, and we put in a grading line and a little cooler, and over time, as it grew, we built onto that barn and made it into what's now called a food hub, a packing house. So 60 or 70 farmers gained access to very substantial markets like Ingalls and Food City and even Whole Foods in Georgia and Maryland through one piece of community capital, an old tobacco barn. A similar thing in Huntington, West Virginia, the Wild Ramp, which of course is an iconic Appalachian, I guess you'd call it an herb, but they were struggling with the food desert issue, and their farmers were struggling with getting enough market. The farmers' market was too small, so they built a community-owned retail space called the Wild Ramp, and they sell products from over 150 local farmers and food artisans, and they've helped to create access to healthy food right in Huntington, West Virginia. Another example is the Clean Energy Collective. This is a group out of Colorado that now has a presence in 10 states, I think, maybe 12. But basically, they pioneered this idea of solar gardens. So we have solar panels in our field because we have a farm and we have the room for it. We've seen rooftop solar, and there's still plenty of room for growth of rooftop solar, but there's two fundamental limitations. One is that a lot of buildings simply are not situated properly, either the angle or whether they're facing south or whether the roof can support it. But another big one is that a lot of renters, like young people, would like to be able to have some of their energy coming from solar, but you can't exactly say to your landlord, I want solar energy, put some panels on the roof. What this does, this community solar gardens, is that they work with, in this case, a group of about 20 households who together find a site close to the neighborhood, to the community. They save a lot of money because all the panels are bought in bulk and installed in bulk, brings the cost down. And then you can buy 30 panels, 35 panels, get 9 megawatts of power, or you can buy 2 panels. But you can buy in at whatever level. And so it's creating this tremendous surge in a lot of places. Unfortunately, neither Virginia nor Tennessee allow this at this point. So this is just a totally sensible, conservative thing to do, these community solar panels. And one more example of this idea of building real wealth comes from New Hampshire, where the New Hampshire Community Loan Fund loaned a group of people, it was a few dozen families living in a trailer park. They loaned them money to buy the land underneath their trailers because all of these folks had been living there for years, but the guy who owned the land on which their mobile home sat decided he was going to sell the land to a developer who wanted to put in whatever, right? Probably a Cabela's. But anyway, they didn't have the money to buy the land, but they got a loan from the New Hampshire Community Loan Fund. They not only got enough money to buy the land, so they now had a permanence, but they had a little extra money for working capital, so they added porches and decks, and they fixed them up. And now that trailer park essentially became a neighborhood, and you built wealth in a place that we don't think of wealth existing. The issue, I know there was an earlier presentation about some of the social justice and racial dimensions, but just one thing I learned in the research for the book. You probably know that there's this enormous gap before the recession and since between white families and black families in household wealth, right? There's a huge gap, far bigger than the income gap. And there's a number of reasons for it. One of them is that when we created the Federal Housing Administration in 1934, federal policy contained language like, you do not want, this was geared towards realtors and lenders, do not lend into neighborhoods where there's an infiltration of a lower grade population or where there was not racial homogeneity. So we built racism into our federal housing policy. Relatively affordable mortgages were the key from the late 1930s until the early 1980s in why a relatively large proportion of white families became middle house. Nothing was more important than household to build liquid capital. And yet, black families and people of color, but particularly black families, were systematically excluded. That did not change in our federal policy until 1968. So again, when we talk about building wealth, we need to think through both the incentives and disincentives. A lot of different things we can do. I'm going to just wrap up and tell you what the other transitions are and then open it to conversation. The fourth one is about this idea of taking sustainability to scale. I use several examples, including Organic Valley. But if there is this emerging healthy economy that's better for people, better for the environment, why isn't there more of it? And there's a lot of reasons to do with public policy, but there's also groups like Organic Valley, DC Solar United Neighbors, and others that are trying to take this to scale so it will become the heart of the economy rather than a little cute little sideline. The fifth transition is about rebuilding a meaningful public debate. We desperately, desperately need that. Groups like Apple Shop in Whitesburg, Kentucky have been engaged in creating and cultivating a real honest to goodness community debate for years. Groups like Swamp Grady Theater in Colquitt, Georgia are using community media and community theater to revitalize their community, to bring people who are different together. Reclaiming public spaces is a big part of the public debate. I had a piece in HuffPost a month or so back called Facebook versus Face-to-Face, and I'm just absolutely convinced that part of why the debate online can be and often is so harsh as well as so shallow is because we don't interact with people who are different from us much anymore. We need those public spaces like this one in Portland, Maine, Congress Square Park to interact with each other. Farmers markets create some of that. On a Saturday morning when they're lining up to get our asparagus and spinach and lettuce mix, we've got the Democracy Now! Listeners, we've got the Raging Libertarians, and we've got the Glenn Beck listeners, all in the same line, all with something in common. They're wanting to eat a little better, they want to be part of this. So we need those public spaces if we're going to reclaim our debate. And the last one is about rebuilding a participatory politics from the bottom up. I'm going to stop by saying, or summarize by saying, you could, as a couple of authors have done in a book called Enough, you could say that our current paradigm of success, of wealth, and of economics is more. Whatever we have, it ain't enough. It's got to be bigger, faster, more. And we need to move towards a paradigm of enough. The key is to recognize that the more paradigm, which has created a lot of innovation and wealth in some respects, it not only has environmental and social problems, the bottom line is we're not happier. Every way you look at it shows that simply the accumulation of more stuff and bigger homes and bigger cars has not worked to deliver healthy, happy people. The idea of enough could revolutionize not just our economic strategy, but even our happiness. So I'll stop there and open it up to conversation.
Anthony, I was going to just get out of politics altogether.
I don't think you're able to do that.
As you have done for a while, I know how to speak to my base. How do we take what you said and get out into the areas where people don't agree with us in terms of our politics? They need to agree with us with what has to be done. Instead of having legislators who decide they want to alter our Constitution to say that all things come from God and not from people, and get out there and talk to the farmers, and talk to people who are out there and need to be able to change the economic base of this. How do we do that? And is there a way we can develop a coalition where we can talk to and get some language that we can go out and talk to?
Yeah, great.
We can win instead of losing.
Right. We've become extraordinarily consistent at losing in most of the bigger arenas. So a number of thoughts. This is a big preoccupation of mine. Nancy mentioned I ran for United States Congress in the 9th District of Virginia, the one just across the border for you, in 2012. And I got my butt kicked, but I didn't enter the race till March of that year, and I got 39% of the vote. It was more than the president or our senator got in my district, I might add. But I ran on a platform that is kind of like this. It was basically not only economic populism, for sure it was that, but it was also about the fact that we had to rebuild our communities, that we needed to create local wealth. And I'll tell you, in the coalfield counties of Virginia, you guys don't really have that, but we have 7, really 5 counties that historically have depended on coal. I did much better there than in the district as a whole. I got 39% overall. I got between 43 and 48% in the counties that were worse hit economically, even though it was the so-called war on coal was being waged and all that kind of stuff. So that gives me a glimmer of hope. I've been working with some folks to try to figure this out. To me, it's partly messaging, it's how we talk about it, but it's also the substance. I've been really banging on the door of the progressive movement, the economic and political progressives, because the truth of it is, there's a lot of elitism on our side. There just is. And one thing among many that the right has done really well is to define elitism primarily as a cultural phenomenon. So somebody who talks a certain way, somebody who dresses a certain way, somebody who insists that their arugula be locally raised, the food habits, they've defined elitism really as a cultural phenomenon, while in fact they've supported economic elitism to the greatest degree possible. But we do easily, I'll speak for myself, fall into kind of a cultural elitism. So part of it, I think, is how we address people and how we talk. In terms of the substance of it, let's take the environment, because there's a lot of places we need to make some changes. I'm working with some folks on the Virginia side, and we are well down the road of crafting what we're calling a rural progressive platform. First and foremost, rural progressive platform. What would that look like? Because rural, not only in Appalachia, but all over this country, has become the antithesis of progressive politics, right? But it's not entirely, it's deceptive. So in this rural progressive platform that we're working on and soon we'll be releasing to the universe, hopefully for some impact, one thing we do, for instance, is talk about how do we discuss the environment. The environmental movement, that probably everybody in this room is part of, talks about the environment in terms of protecting the environment. Our language is always about keeping people from mucking it up, right? And of course we've needed that, and we still need it, and clearly we're going to need it for the next 4 years. But rural people fundamentally come from a closer relationship to what we would more often call the land, and we're in a use relationship with the land. We use it. We use it as hunters, as fishermen. I mean, I have a 22 because I need a 22 on my farm, so I have to keep the groundhogs and whatnot away from the crops. We have a different relationship. I have a chainsaw because we heat our greenhouse with wood. You know, so there's a use relationship, and the environmental movement has played into the elitism story that the right has told by not recognizing that enough, fundamentally and consistently, because we're always talking about protecting it. We're always talking about keeping people from messing it up, regulating it so people won't mess it up. Of course we need that, but we also need to recognize that for rural communities, livelihood is still significant, not totally, but is still significantly based on the land. So that's one example of ways we're trying to do it. I'll say one more, which is this idea of self-reliance. Self-reliance is as working class and as rural a principle as there is out there. Nobody likes to be dependent. Nobody likes that. But for many working class people, rural and urban, I think the shift to the right, which has a lot of reasons behind it, is fundamentally because people no longer feel like they can take care of themselves, right? There's just this sense of insecurity, the sense that somebody else is controlling it. We think, in this room, that it's the big corporations. They've been persuaded it's big government. But either way, people don't like to feel insecure. Men and women, adults, human beings want to feel like they can take care of themselves. And so mechanisms to create more self-reliant households and communities are treated very well, responded to very well by people that otherwise may not be in this room. So that's a couple thoughts. Yes?
Yes, I noticed that at least twice when you were discussing income inequality and the regulations, that you said there wasn't that much of a difference during the Obama administration. I find the need to point out that 6 of the 8 years of the Obama administration, Republicans were in charge of Congress. And that just emphasizes the importance of voting every 2 years and not just coming out every 4 years for the presidential election. It is the Congress that writes the budgets, distributes the funds, EPA, whether or not the EPA gets zeroed out as the president, whatever. And the people need to get out of this area. Typically, what is it? 12 to 15% came out for the midterms in the last couple of cycles.
So I completely agree with that. You're right. I mean, virtually everything he tried to do, as a matter of principle, they stopped. But let me also say that it was President Obama who chose Larry Summers and Tim Geithner, and that choice clearly signaled a belief in trickle-down economics, for lack of any other way to say it. That's what it meant. Whether or not he could have succeeded with, Robert Reich and other economists like that, I don't know. But he certainly went the traditional route. Yes.
One of the really strong concerns I have is about, and you've really talked about this, but how everything's going to be so automated. I think in the next 5 years it's going to be dramatically changed, and over the next decade, I can't even imagine 10 years from now. With that said, what you're talking about just rings so true to me in terms of local empowerment, local people coming together, artists coming together, farmers coming together, mechanics coming together, local groups to just really say we can compete with Walmart. We can do that if we believe in ourselves and our own voices. We can do that. But I think one of the problems that we face, and this is politically too, the rhetoric out there has so demeaned progressive viewpoints. And not just demeaned them, but called them evil. And also convinced people that their voices do not hold much power. And when you believe that, you're done. You're defeated. But as long as you hold on to the belief that you have power, that your voice has power, and that locally your voices can really make a difference, you're never defeated. And you really can make a difference for the better. And I don't know, I just wanted to say that.
Sure. A couple of quick responses. On the automation side, I'm sure many of you have been hearing this. It's in the news more and more. Some of the projections out of Oxford and elsewhere, 50% of the full profile of U.S. jobs are vulnerable to artificial intelligence and robotics by 2030. Some of the estimates are worse than that. And that's just a startling thing. And I read a book called Rise of the Robots that went into that in great detail. It's really, it is shocking. But, so it's all the more reason to have more self-reliant households and communities, not only around food, but around our energy utilization, our waste flows, the nutrient cycles, everything that sort of makes life possible needs to be a preoccupation. We need to do as much of that as possible close to home. Some things don't make sense. We can't do them close to home, but we need to. And my thinking is that, I guess this is wishful thinking perhaps, but my thinking is that as more and more traditional jobs are lost to AI and robotics, although I think public policy plays a role there too, because it encourages our public policy, our tax policy, our economic policy, our accounting procedures on the IRS tax ones. They all encourage companies to replace people with machines, and so artificial intelligence is just the latest example. But anyway, as we confront that, I think we can also create a substantial number of jobs in the technologies of resilience. Everything from cleaning up water and using water far more conservatively, to small-scale equipment that a small farmer can use to make himself or herself a little more productive, to better technologies of health and wellness so that we actually start to focus on being well rather than treating sickness. I think there's going to be an emergence of other occupations and certain kinds of technologies and service providers that can support that if we begin to build it now. But we're going to have to start now. Yes.
A
few weeks ago, I ran across an article, probably in Huffington Post, that had the thesis that Appalachia has a lot to contribute to transforming the economy because Appalachia has a tradition of an ethic of enough. And I wondered if you wrote it. If you didn't, if you know who did, and what your opinion is about whether you think that's true, that Appalachia, that people in Appalachia are more likely to accept this idea of enough rather than forever more, as the economists preach at.
I was going to show you another slide, but that's okay. Yes, I think that Appalachia does have an ethic that's, I've never put it in terms of an ethic of enough, but I think you're probably right. I've often talked about that Appalachia specifically and rural areas generally have an ethic of frugality, that people believe in being frugal, and that wastefulness is just sort of fundamentally. And along with that, until recently, now this is all under the, Appalachia's, under the same media pressures as everybody else, the image issues, and so I think it's all changing. But as part of that ethic of frugality, it was also considered to be sort of grotesque to have conspicuous consumption. And the people who did, whether they were a coal company exec or a lawyer with a lot of money, were sort of, it wasn't something that was looked up to, right? So I think that is getting to that ethic of enough. The other thing I'll say, can I go backwards?
Yes, you may.
And I'm going forward.
No, that was backwards.
That was backwards? Okay. By the way, I have a great YouTube channel called Take 5 with Tony. I talk about all these issues in 5-minute segments, most of them filmed on my phone. I say it's great. I think it's great. You won't think it sucks. But some of this is like, for instance, this guy right here, I've been to his factory. He's in Radford, Virginia, about an hour and a half north of Abingdon. He's producing these SIPS panels, structurally insulated panel systems, for homes, for commercial buildings, for schools and everything else. He's employing a goodly chunk of people, a couple dozen, but these panels reduce energy use by 50% compared to a well-insulated stick-built home. Well-insulated. And they're tremendously storm-worthy. In many places where there's been, if not a tornado, something approaching it, they're the only building left standing. Now think about more resilient communities, think about an ethic of enough, and think about what are the emerging markets for products that we're going to need. What does the world need? What does our community need? Well, that's an example of a product that's hitting a lot of good buttons. Super energy efficiency, reduced emissions, storm worthiness. That's a climate change product if I've ever seen one. And yet we spend far too little time in our economic deliberations, especially the most highly paid people, thinking about what would actually serve the community. We just think about how do we create markets for a product. So I think, again, Appalachia can lead the way because I started a homeownership program for low-income families 30-some years ago. And they said it couldn't be done. We did it in Southwest Virginia. It went from Lee County up to Christiansburg, and then it became a model for the state. So I think oftentimes the limited resource communities financially are the most innovative, or can be. Getting to your point. Yes?
Well, the board has read your book, and this is an...
Were they moved to tears?
Almost. The first part, I have to say that the transitions are important, but it gets scary at the first part.
Yeah.
But anyway, I do encourage you to get the book and read it, and that's an unsolicited plug. But I also remember there was a section there also about bartering and exchange of services, because income, and I grew up in a small community in Wisconsin, and you knew somebody who was a plumber. You didn't pay him plumber rates, but you promised to pay his field next June. You know what I mean? There are things like that we are not availing ourselves of enough, just like the tool library and other kinds of things. We need to think differently. And I just feel like, I hope that this symposium, the group of people who have shown up here and have visited in and out throughout the day, will think about who else is here and who we haven't talked to, and make that bridge, because we need to be crossing paths and sharing commonalities. And I think the bartering thing, I think many of the things in your book are so resonant for our area particularly, but just in general for communities. We have to start thinking on a community level. We really just need to do that, and then that will expand to regional.
Very good. So I'm going to just respond to that, but I have to do a quick book thing. Dottie? So I never turned on the internet advice to enable people to swipe a card. By the way, we can take credit cards. So checks are fine, but I was just going to say, if you would reach into that box, get that little Verizon device, and press the on button, it'll take about 45 seconds, and then we'll be able to use the card swipe. Yeah, so it's also very true, and this relates to the comment about robotics and replacing jobs. One of this idea of moving towards productive resilience, my transition says from consumptive dependence to productive resilience. We're all in this consumptive dependence mode, right? So our wages have been flat and all that. That's all very true, and it's a very real issue. But it's also true that we've simply adopted lifestyles that depend on a lot more money to maintain our lives. And obviously, if you shift from being a farmer to living in a city, some of that's going to go with it. But a big part of the bottom-up economy is being able to live with less cash. Because when we can live with less cash, the alternative is usually either individual or sort of household productivity. Again, Wendell Berry says our households, which used to be places of productivity, are now essentially units of consumption. And then the other thing is that if you don't have a lot of cash and you don't buy stuff, and you don't have all the skills you need, which most of us don't, there's only one other alternative. It's relationships. It's knowing people who can do stuff that you don't. So when we start moving from this recognition that even those of us that think we're highly trained professionals are really quite dependent people. We depend on all kinds of other people, usually for money, to provide us with the necessities of our life. It starts with our food and our energy, but it moves towards many other things, including parenting, childcare, etc. To the degree that we can become less dependent on cash, more dependent on the skills and resourcefulness of our own community and relationships with others, that will go a long way towards also mitigating this job loss thing. Because maybe in 2 generations, when my kids are my age in 1 generation, maybe they'll simply live well with half the income that I ever made, which wouldn't be much. But that would be, I think, a real goal. There was another question? Yes?
I just wanted to take this opportunity to plug something. I'm on the board of directors for our local co-op we're trying to get started here, and to me that's a transformational way to build community, but also to provide an outlet for our farmers and for others to be able to sell their produce and other items too. So if anyone is interested in finding out more about the Johnson City Food Co-op, I'm going to put this up here by Carol. Please just put your name on here. We'll add you to the list and let you know when we're meeting again. But again, I think it'll be transformational for us here. And I'm thinking tool library there at the food co-op.
That's right. So that's cool.
There's a lot of opportunities to do that. So.
Very good. And I'll tell you, in the book, there's a lot of places that have a great co-op. Burlington, Vermont, many places. But I write about a place in rural New Mexico called La Montanita. And they started as, like a lot of the old buying clubs did, with a couple dozen families coming to somebody's basement once a month to divvy up the cheese and the flour. They now have 17,000 members in New Mexico. They have 6 storefronts in Albuquerque, Santa Fe, Taos. They have their own warehouse distribution center, and they buy from close to 400 farmers. But these members not only help them buy this healthy local food and organic food and all of that, but additionally they have enough cash flow that they've created their own loan program, a low-interest loan program, to help people get into farming and food businesses. So this is the, as you say, transformative potential of a cooperative. Absolutely critical. Thanks for bringing that up. I don't know, maybe we have time for one more if there's any other burning question. You know how people say that there's no such thing as a stupid question? I've actually heard some stupid questions in all of my time speaking, but I don't want that to intimidate you. I'm teasing about that. Good. All right.
First, we haven't plugged Green Interfaith Network enough in this. I want to ask all the attendees, please make sure that you're a member of the Green Interfaith Network. Because the role of this group, the mission of Green Interfaith, is to not only green our churches, our own churches that where we worship, but also to expand that to the membership of our churches and so their own houses, And that's one community where we can have an impact. And I think that's also, and this might have come up before you came in, is how we as sometimes called elitists can have a dialogue, a connection with our rural neighbors, and where we don't seem to have, where our concerns maybe aren't resonating in a way that we would hope that they would also understand. But maybe in our churches, we can make that connection. And so please, there are even goodies that you can get by joining Green Interfaith Network. So please do it. Thank you.
Great, and I'll just close with a quick story if I can. So thank you for that. Yeah, GINI is a very important group, and I'm so glad you all are still going strong after all these years. So back to the question of kind of how do we connect with other people, because it's daunting, and I haven't totally figured it out, but I've fooled around with a few different things. A story from my campaign. So back in 2012, again, as I said, I had pretty strong support in the coal fields. That was partly because the mine workers knew me from the Pittston coal strike when I marched with them and all that stuff. But it was partly, fundamentally, because I was spouting this bottom-up populist economic policy. They knew I was an environmentalist and they were nervous as could be about that, but they endorsed me nevertheless, and I got, did pretty well. Well, anyway, in April of that year, 2012, was when President Obama came out in favor of marriage equality, gay marriage, right? I had already done it at the beginning of my campaign, but I was so obscure that nobody knew about it. So I started getting inquiries about it, and I went to Russell County to do my little stump speech, which is right in the heart of the coal fields. And this older gentleman who was a retired miner, who had become a big fan of mine, he came to all my events. He met me in the parking lot, and he says to me, "What do you think about that bombshell President Obama dropped on us?" And I assumed he was talking about something to do with the EPA. But he wasn't. He was talking about marriage equality. I looked at him and said, the gay marriage. So we started talking about it between the car and my talk, just through the parking lot. And he, of course, starts to talk about how the Bible talks about homosexuality as an abomination and blah, blah, blah. And I heard him out, and then I said, yeah, I know it probably seems pretty odd to you. I said, but the way I read the Bible, the main thing it says is that we're supposed to love everybody, especially people we find hardest to love, people who seem most different. I think that's the main thing. And he studied on that for a minute or two, and then he said, "Yeah, I guess you're right. I suppose they're just born that way." Well, here's the point of the story. There's no way I could have opened that window a crack on an issue that was nothing to do with my direct speech. There's no way I could have opened it up unless he felt some trust in me, and the trust came from the fact that he saw me as a working man, which I am, but also he saw me as somebody who stood with working people. And that created, I think, a little window that allowed him to evaluate an issue that probably in his church he was getting a very different message about. So again, I think fundamentally we need to make livelihoods and the economy much more central to our conversations about the environment. Because right now they're usually antagonistic in the way we debate and do public policy, and that's just ridiculous. Thanks so much.